welcome to Human Ascension with Ellie. Today we are going right back to the very beginning. I don't mean the beginning of the show, I mean the beginning of pretty much everything. We're going right back to the very beginning, right back to the earliest known written evidence of the human language, actually. We're going back to the Sumerian tablets. The Sumerian tablets are an ancient clay artifact from around 3,500 BC to around 2000 BC, so between 4 and maybe 7,000 years ago. They were inscribed in a language called cuneiform script, which is one of the earliest forms of writing. At the time that they were discovered, we were not really able to understand them because they were written in a peculiar way. However, this did change ultimately. The cuneiform script appears as though it's a series of lines and triangles or wedges. The lines may appear horizontally, vertically, or in slanted formation of various different degrees. They're angled at certain degrees, and each degree differential makes up a difference to the sound that it represents. There may be any number of lines in cuneiform script, and the same goes for the triangle or wedge shapes as well. They aren't actually triangles, but they do have a triangular kind of appearance. The combination, the direction, and the number of the lines and triangle type shapes determines the sounds that would have been spoken by the Sumerians. And the combinations can be very simple or highly intricate. So these tablets recorded various aspects of daily life, including administrative details or records, legal codes, literature, and religious texts as well. The Sumerian tablets were discovered in the 19th century at the ancient Sumerian city of Kish, which fell under the geography and timeline of Mesopotamia, which is now known as the country of Iraq. Shortly after their discovery, a British Army officer by the name of Henry Rawlinson, who also happened to be a scholar, because, why not? Well, he managed to successfully decipher the inscriptions that appeared on some of the tablets. This made it possible for other scholars to continue with translation of the tablets and also other ancient texts as time went on. This has resulted in some quite extraordinary outcomes. So the telling of the story of how humanity first appeared or became civilized on Earth, depending on whose version or whose interpretation you believe. And the story defies everything that's being taught to us by the usual traditional forms of education, science, religion, and history. So much so, in fact, that a lot of what the Sumerian tablets say is being ignored by the scientific or religious establishments, because by accepting the Sumerian version of events, of how humanity appeared on Earth in the form that it does, everything that science in particular has been telling us, or what they've been holding to be true, including the theory of evolution, turns out to be pretty wrong, actually. But it also explains a lot about why we're here and why we are the way that we are. Our tendency to meet challenges with a response like hostility or violence comes from our roots. Our tendency towards a patriarchal system of life as well comes or is explained through the Sumerian texts. And also that weird tendency that we have to continuously tell ourselves that we're becoming more and more advanced, while evidence keeps cropping up that shows us that actually we aren't quite as advanced as we used to be a very long time ago, potentially. But most importantly, the Sumerian tablets tell the story of a previously unknown race of intelligent, sentient beings called the Annunaki. And it's exciting. And if the Sumerian tablets are anything to go by, the Annunaki either created us themselves or they found us here on Earth and transformed us from wild animals to the species of human that we are today. So let's talk about the Annunaki. Let's imagine a world where the stories that are carved into the ancient Sumerian tablets aren't just stories. They're echoes of a forgotten reality. It does seem peculiar for an entire race of beings to meticulously carve every aspect of day-to-day life onto a stone tablet, but to omit any form of reality when it comes to their existence, and instead just tell a fantasy story of something that never happened, along with discussions about, intricate details of daily life. This is what we have to believe if we believe that the Sumerian tablets are just a mixture of actual rules and laws and actual religious beliefs and actual daily routines. Oh, and, every now and then a fantasy story about a race of beings called the Annunaki that they just kind of disperse into all the other mundane stuff. It just doesn't make any sense. And anyone who listens to me at all will know that I live by the Judge Judy rule. Okay? And that is that the simplest explanation is probably the truth. That's my motto when it comes to looking at what might be wrong and what might be right. And the simplest explanation here is that the Sumerian tablets recorded day-to-day life, rules and laws, religious beliefs, and the real account of Sumerian experiences with a race of beings called the Annunaki, because they believed that it belonged with all of the other historical records that they were time capsuling onto their tablets at the time. That makes more sense, doesn't it? So let's take a look and see what the tablets actually say. And for any geeks out there, I'm using a variety of different resources. I know that people like to know where I'm getting information from. So my sources for today's episode include 3 different books, actually 4 different books, and also some of the English translations of the tablets themselves. The books that I'm referencing are The 12th Planet by Zachariah Sitchin, Escaping from Eden by Paul Wallace, The Annunaki Connection written by Heather Lynn, PhD, and also the English translations that I'm using today come from the book called The Sumerian Tablets from Umma, which was written in 1915 by C.L. Bedale, M.A. That one's an old one. I found that one on the website archive.org. I'm actually going to include a link to that particular book, the really old book, in the description for today's episode because it has interesting diagrams in it as well. It's not so much that you can read, you're welcome to read that book, the one by Bedale called The Sumerian Tablets from Umma. You're welcome to read it. You don't have to though, and if you do try and read it word for word, you're likely to just give yourself a massive headache. But what you can see if you click the link that's provided is what the tablets actually looked like, what the language looked like, and also how each of the sounds that was depicted by the lines and triangular wedges that were carved into the text were translated into a language about very simple things. So it helps you to see the building blocks of how the interpretations of the tablets can be formulated. Okay, just so that you can see how credible some of these interpretations are likely to be. There's a lot of discussion in the tablets that you'll be able to see in the book about measuring barley and tending to daily life. It just doesn't make sense to include storytelling about fantasy beings in the middle of all of that, very mundane stuff. And if you do take a look, remember that every time you see a translation with the letters A-N together, representing An or Anu, or any other words that use those sounds like Anki or Annunaki, you're looking at examples of the Annunaki or aspects of the Annunaki or people. It's either the personal names of particular Annunaki or the presence of some form of Annunaki in the middle of the experience being described. I'll explain this in more detail in a few moments. I've also referred to the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature, which is an open source library of information about the Sumerian method of language, which was compiled by the University of Oxford about 10 to 15 years ago. So the Sumerian texts portray the beings that they refer to as the Annunaki as more than just gods or other forms of deity. They are described by the Sumerians to be powerful physical entities who shaped the world and also ruled over the world for a period of time. And there are other writings that refer to similar styled entities which are described in Babylonian poetry. From what we can tell, the Sumerian civilization existed from around about 4100 BC until around 1750 BC, and then overlapping that time period slightly, the Babylonians existed from around 1894 BC until around 539 BC. So there was some overlap of about 200 years there. And then there were a series of subsequent empires that ruled for shorter periods until Alexander the Great showed up and the Emperor Constantine and the rest of them, the ones that sound more familiar. Because those later periods are when the Hebrew Bible and ultimately Islam and Christianity were formed, then the religions that we know today were conceptualized. But first, from what the tablets appear to state, around 5,000 or so years earlier, came the Sumerians. So the simplest way to connect the Sumerian tablets to this language that appears to identify a race of beings called the Annunaki is to look at the language. In Sumerian, the sound an, written an, means sky or heaven, and the sound ki means earth. And once the entirety of the language is translated so that every individual's name and place and time can be identified, it becomes easy to believe that the word Annunaki means those who came from the heavens to the earth. But this isn't enough. There needs to be some kind of tangible evidence that corroborates this idea of entities that traveled from the heavens to the earth. So let's take a look at what else appears in the Sumerian texts that might help us to understand the relevance that they have, the Sumerians, to what we've always thought was kind of said and done and knowledge that, is absolutely right. Now, it's important to remember that everything about the Sumerian tablets is an interpretation. It's a language that is extremely old that has been deciphered, and based on the deciphering of the language and an assumption of cultural context, then interpretations of what was actually being written is being made pretty much the same as everything else that is interpreted and understood in some way. And the people that I'm referring to today and the resources that I'm using for today's episode didn't always have the same interpretation. So there's differences between, say, for example, Zachariah Sitchin's interpretation and Heather Lynn's interpretation and other things that I've been able to see as well. And when I've seen notable differences, I'm mentioning it in today's show. There may also be other different interpretations that are not part of today's episode that I won't be able to cover because, I do have to stop talking eventually. So, according to interpretation by the author Zachariah Sitchin, the extraterrestrial Anunnaki resided on a planet called Nibiru. They faced a dire crisis due to a severe environmental degradation. This was due to the advancements of the Anunnaki race. As much as advancement of a civilization promises to solve the world's problems, it also tends to spend far more time burning off the world's natural resources. And Nibiru was no exception to that. The advancement of the Anunnaki race had created a catastrophic climate disaster. Its atmosphere was deteriorating at an alarming rate, and the only solution for Anunnaki that they deemed feasible was to locate a substance that was capable of restoring the atmosphere on Nibiru. Somewhere along the line, they discovered that the reflective properties of gold, when it was dispersed in really fine particles within the atmosphere, could actually scatter solar radiation. And by scattering the solar radiation, it became diluted and less harmful to the atmosphere and ultimately to the planet of Nibiru. It was acting like a protective shield. So desperate to save their planet, the Anunnaki began exploring other celestial bodies in search of this precious metal, gold. And as it happens, they found gold on Earth. The Anunnaki sent their best and their brightest via spacecraft, obviously, the preferred mode of travel, which was capable of undertaking long interplanetary journeys. These vessels, as described by Sitchin's interpretation, utilized advanced propulsion technologies, possibly even anti-gravitational mechanisms, which enabled them to travel vast different distances quite quickly. I think it's pretty safe to say that the arrival of the Anunnaki in spaceships would have been quite a monumental event for anyone living in early Mesopotamia. Now, the Sumerian tablets are not discussing the Anunnaki in terms of how they arrived during Sumerian times. So it's a recalling of history. The Anunnaki had already gone by the time the tablets were written. The tablets discuss a much earlier time, perhaps as long ago as 450,000 years ago. It was during a time when the Earth was populated by a pre-human species that paleoanthropologists call Homo erectus. The Babylonians have a poem called the Atrahasis poem that talks about how a lower race of gods, they were kind of like a second tier of gods, were the first to work in mines here on Earth. And the translation of that poem goes a bit like this. So it goes, when the gods instead of man did the work and bore the loads, the gods' load was too great, the work too hard, the trouble too much. It's believed that the Anunnaki, when they discovered gold on Earth, they summoned a second tier, kind of like a lower class of Nibirans called the Ajiji. And the Ajiji were brought onto Earth to excavate the gold and transport it back to Nibiru. They were considered in the Sumerian text to be like a second tier of gods. The Anunnaki were the first tier and the Ajiji were the second tier, so not quite as senior. They were the ones who were delegated to do this hard, arduous labour of mining for gold. So in Nibiru, the Ajiji were not deities or rulers of any kind. They were just ordinary Nibirians, I guess. Kind of like the equivalent of, slaves back in human history, or even draft horses or something like that. I didn't look deep enough to be able to know what the Ajiji looked like. I do have physical descriptions for the Anunnaki, but the Ajiji probably had a different type of appearance. They may have even been a different type of species. I don't know. I have to probably go back on another occasion and look at that even deeper. But they were there and they were kind of strapped in and expected to, do the equivalent of what a draft horse would do and plow the land, but basically mine for gold. But when they arrived on Earth, both the Ajiji and the Anunnaki were able to perform what appeared to be like divine actions and produce divine types of results. And so they were looked up to as being quite heavenly and mysterious beings, a bit like gods, but not the highest gods. Those were the Anunnaki. Anyway, the Ajiji were exhausted by the harsh conditions and the excessive workload that they were expecting to perform. They were expected to perform on Earth. And ultimately, they revolted against the Anunnaki. They could no longer endure the physical toll of mining for gold and whatever other physical labor they had to do to support their bosses. So they ultimately destroyed their tools and they refused to work, a bit like an industrial action kind of scenario. So the Anunnaki had a bit of a dilemma. Anyway, so the family tree of the Anunnaki, just to sort of sidetrack a little bit, it went like this. At the highest point of the Anunnaki was the supreme god. The supreme god's name was Anu, which then leads you automatically to understand why the rest of his lineage was described as deriving from Anu, being the Anunnaki. Anu is described in Sumerian literature as being the king of the gods, or the sky father. Anu had 12 children. I've seen discrepancies in whether he had 7 daughters and 5 sons or 6 daughters and 6 sons. It all depends on which book you're referring to or which reference you're referring to. It kind of does make a difference, though, because down the line, these children become representatives of the 12 celestial bodies referred to as the zodiac constellations. So I'm assuming, for the purposes of today's episode, that there were probably 6 masculine and 6 feminine children to correspond with the 6 masculine and 6 feminine zodiac signs of the constellation. So I'm just going to benchmark that, and one day I'll see if I can link that together more closely. I do touch upon it later on in today's show. But it's also important to remember something else about the Anunnaki. They are described in a variety of Mesopotamian writings as being the shining ones, which I think is really interesting. They were luminous, with a kind of a bluish type of skin tone. Now, the author Heather Lynn, who wrote the book Anunnaki Connection, explains this as being due to the fact that the Anunnaki had blue blood rather than red, which suddenly explains that saying about blue-blooded royalty, doesn't it? It kind of links it and shows you just how old that saying may be. It's a legacy taken from the Sumerian understanding of the blue, luminous gods that came from the sky. So the most important of Anu's children in today's episode, despite the fact that he had 12, are 2 of his sons. Their names were Enlil and Enki. Enlil was the one put in charge of Earth. He was mean. He was a cruel god. Enlil was described in Mesopotamian writing as being the god of air. And he was the chief deity of the early Anunnaki settlement on Earth, according to the Sumerian text. The other son, Enki, was very different. Enki was a compassionate god. And Enlil and Enki both had the same father, who was Anu, but they had different mothers, which may have been one of the reasons why they were so different. So Enki was the compassionate god, and the Sumerians referred to him as the god of wisdom and water. Now, interestingly, this corresponds with what I understand about the Rider-Waite tarot deck as well. We've got our we've got 5 essential elements, but 4 of them are earthly elements, and they are air, water, earth, and fire. Well, we're only talking about 2 of those elements today, and that is the air and the water. The air represents intellect and communication, so this would include things like technological advancement and ability to have an advanced type of intellect. And water relates more to love and compassion. So it's interesting that Enlil, who was the god of air, was the one who was in charge and also appeared to be the most technologically advanced. And Enki was the one who was more compassionate, representing the god of water. I just think that was really interesting because it just goes to show that nothing really changes. We've actually, even the tarot cards that I use every day on the Ellie Dreams Under channel have a connection to the relevance between Enlil and Enki. So as it happens, the yucky one, Enlil, well, he was the boss here on Earth. Okay, and the Ajiji workers surrounded the house when they went to protest. They surrounded the house of Enlil, demanding an end to their suffering. Okay, so this created this dilemma for the Anunnaki. At this point in time, the Anunnaki had to try and figure out what to do because the Ajiji were just not going to continue working. They were on strike. And the Anunnaki at this point had pretty much ignored the Homo erectus species on Earth. They were just another animal similar to all of the other animals on Earth. They ate and they drank with animals. They were barbarian in their behavior, and they were certainly barbarian by Anunnaki standards. The Anunnaki showed up and they were beautifully dressed. They were adorned in precious metals and stones, and very much like we're seeing, a variety of different depictions of the Anunnaki just as I'm speaking, which are based on our interpretation of what's written into Mesopotamian writings. So they were adorned, they were wearing metallic protective items of clothing, they were a very civilized, they had systems of government, they had all kinds of things that were very different to these Homo erectus species that basically lived just like any other animal on Earth did. But, of course, when the Ajiji refused to work, the Anunnaki still needed to mine the gold, and they certainly weren't going to do it themselves. So they decided to create a new species of worker who could take over the heavy labour from the Ajiji. They needed to have the robustness of an animal, but they needed to have the intellect to be able to know what to do. There is so that they could work autonomously, and there is a disagreement about how to interpret this aspect of the Sumerian writings on how the human race was ultimately created to solve this dilemma, and whether it proves or disproves the idea that our current human form stems from an earlier race called Homo erectus. So on one hand, a literal translation of the Sumerian texts concludes that humans were a blend of clay or dirt and divine blood. But if we look beyond the literal and adopt a symbolic reference to the translation, it sounds a bit like the Anunnaki used a form of advanced technology to alter the DNA of the Homo erectus species. In Sumerian writings, there is reference made to the black-headed ones being identified as the species that could be utilized in place of the Ajiji if they were just tweaked a little bit. Just the fact that the Anunnaki referred to the black-headed ones as being notable, something that, they could identify them by being black-headed, would indicate that the Anunnaki themselves didn't have black hair. In fact, they are described in the Sumerian text as being very tall or very large in size, at least 10 feet in height, and maybe as much as 16 feet in height. The Anunnaki are also described as having blonde or pale red curly hair and a luminous pale blue skin, as I mentioned before, due, potentially, according to Heather Lynn, to them having a blue blood. Because the skin is relatively translucent. One of the reasons why we have a pinkish or reddish warm hue to our skin, regardless of our ethnicity, is because the skin allows for the color of the red blood to be somewhat visible through the skin's translucent properties. And that's the reason why we have this kind of reddish type of element to our skin. Well, the theory there is that the reason why the Anunnaki had a bluish tinge is because through that pale skin, the blueness of their blood was coming through and visible. So they're also, the Anunnaki are also described with the word ni, N-I, which means to experience a physical tingling sensation. And the sensation that was physically tingling that was experienced by anyone who saw or was in the presence of the Anunnaki may very well be something very similar to the emotional type of response that people such as Jacob Barber or Chris Bledsoe have described when meeting some kind of a celestial non-human energy or force. I don't know whether it's the same, but a barbarian race of beings would feel something that could be almost described as a tingling emotion, but they may not know how to articulate it. And so it might actually be just described as a physical tingling, very much like you would feel if you're in a heightened state of emotional, sensation of some kind. I'm only hypothesizing, it may not be relevant, but it's just sort of interesting how so many of these descriptions across a broad base of different theories all seem to kind of overlap or hint at each other in some way. So the sensation was being experienced in the presence of the Anunnaki. They had some kind of an energy element about them that caused this physical tingling sensation. And by altering the DNA of the Homo erectus species, the Anunnaki may have and appear to have, if the Sumerian text is anything to go by, they appear to have created a new race of beings which aligns the Homo sapien human race, which simply speaking is what we are today. Except perhaps, hopefully, we've moved along a little bit since our earlier times, although, these days you do wonder. So switching over to science for a minute, and the advances of science, or more accurately, the lack of scientific advancement. Okay. Science has given this theory of how humans were created, but the theory of DNA alterations or modification or genetic modification of the Homo erectus species to turn them into the Homo sapien species could create some traction here. And the reason for that is because the world of science has not conclusively managed to prove, beyond a reasonable doubt, a direct evolutionary link between Homo erectus and Homo sapien species. They have kind of concluded that there's a link, but there isn't actually a direct observable link. There are scientists who claim that it's close enough for us to take the theory of evolution as having been resolved. But there are just as many scientists who say that there isn't enough evidence out there to conclude anything yet. And according to science, Homo erectus lived from around 1.9 million years ago until around 110,000 years ago. And evidence also shows that Homo sapiens lived from around 300,000 years ago until the present day. So there's a gap of around 190,000 years that needs to be explained, which leads half of the science world to believe that we just need to find that missing link. It's under the ground there somewhere, and one day we'll find it. But the other half of science points out something very interesting that took place in around Africa and the Middle Eastern regions. And the regions are really important. Apparently, during that 190,000 missing years, both Homo erectus and Homo sapien species existed together. And there's evidence of this in Africa and sections of the Middle East. They were two different species, therefore, which means that they can't have evolved from one to the other. You just can't. And that bit is conveniently always missing from the vast array of traditional educational materials that generally make it to schools and universities. You can't evolve from something if you already exist when it exists. It's like saying that an apple is going to evolve into an orange because they're both fruit and they're sitting on the same plate. So the basic differences between Homo erectus and Homo sapien are as follows. Homo erectus, which is the older species, had a smaller brain size by nearly half the size of Homo sapiens. Homo erectus was less intelligent and did not have advanced cognitive abilities, but Homo sapiens did. Homo erectus had a more robust build with heavier bones and a more pronounced brow, similar to what you'd see in an ape. And science has been able to show the evolutionary links between the variety of different apes leading to Homo erectus species. It's just that gap between Homo erectus and Homo sapiens that they're having trouble with. The Homo sapiens were leaner with lighter bones, which in itself is a sign of something interesting. Lighter bones would indicate a difference in the rate of gravity or the strength of gravity for which the species originated from. So, for example, science has shown that the massive dinosaurs were able to exist back in their era because the gravity of the Earth was lighter, allowing them to grow larger. Those dinosaurs would be unable to grow as large today, and so therefore they would be smaller and denser because gravity has become stronger over the passage of time. Now remember what I said about the appearance of the Annunaki. They were taller, as much as 16 feet tall. They were taller and they were larger, as though they came from a place that experienced a weaker gravity than Earth. And chances are they were lighter as well as a result of that. Perhaps that's why the Ajiji found physical work so difficult. Perhaps they were working in an environment of far stronger gravity than they were accustomed to. And that's the reason why they had trouble coping with that physical workload. But quickly, looking at some of the other differences between Homo erectus and the earlier Homo sapiens. The Homo erectus species appeared to have a very primitive form of communication, things like grunting or making sounds that express fear or sadness or hunger, much like any other kind of animal. Homo sapiens had complex language and were able to think symbolically or metaphorically as well. That's quite an advancement, isn't it? And while Homo erectus might have had a very basic social structure, much like apes do, where you will have a family or a tribe and various routine actions might take place, Homo sapiens had advanced cultural practices, including art and music and elaborate rituals, including spiritual or religious-based rituals. They were two very different species, and somehow, in Africa and the Middle East, they existed at the same time, in the same part of the world. And that part of the world is the part that the Bible refers to in the Old Testament. Yes, everything goes back to the Old Testament. And the reason for that is because according to Sumerian writings, the very first human who was created by either using clay and some kind of divine blood or by genetic modification by the Annunaki, the first human who was created to work in place of the Ajiji was called Adama. And Adama is just one letter away from the word Adam. The very first human Adam who appears in the book of Genesis in the Bible. Now, according to Zachariah Sitchin's book, Adama was the first being with enhanced biology and higher intelligence, making him suitable for the tasks that the Annunaki required. Adama is a word that actually means earth or soil in Hebrew. And in the book of Genesis, there's a verse that describes how the first human Adam was created. And I'm going to read it out to you now so that you can kind of see the similarities with the Sumerian text. This is Genesis chapter 2, verse 7. And it says, "Then the Lord God formed man of dust from the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being." So how do you like that? The Sumerian texts say exactly the same thing, but more than 4,000 years before the Hebrew Bible does, which of course is the basis for the Old Testament. I'm not saying that we should take literally that humanity was created when an extraterrestrial being breathed life into a bit of dirt from the ground, but this might have been how it was perceived or interpreted by whoever was originally telling the story. But also the story was not created for the Bible. It was created for something else. And that's something that I'm interested in because it was created more than 4,000 years earlier because it appears in the Sumerian literature. Now, I want you to bear with me for a second because it's going to sound like I'm going off on a wild tangent here, but it will eventually become obvious why I'm doing this by the time I'm done. Okay, so I'm switching to something different that I want to talk about. If you've been watching or listening to this show from the start, you will recall that I did an episode not that long ago about the changing of the sun gods every 2,000 years or so. This happens each time the zodiac or astrological age shifts from one to another, which we are currently in the process of. We're presently living in the age of Pisces, but we aren't exactly. We are inside the transition period between the age of Pisces and the age of Aquarius. And there will come a time when we are fully in the age of Aquarius. And if history is anything to go by, we will have completely different beliefs by the time we are fully inside the age of Aquarius. Religion, as we know it, will be replaced with something entirely different. Our way of life will be entirely different. We might even be different ourselves. We will have a new perspective on everything, on reality, because that has so far happened every time humanity shifts into a new zodiac age. The shift from one to another is based on the alignment of the Earth's equator to the Sun. The Earth is revolving and orbiting the Sun, and its north-south alignment is gradually shifting as part of its orbit. It takes just under 26,000 years or so, just under 26,000 years, actually it's 25,800 years, for the Earth to complete its astrological cycle around the 12 different zodiac constellations. If you divide 25,800 between the 12 zodiac constellations, then Earth appears to shift into a new zodiac age every 2,150 years. However, due to the elliptical or oblong kind of cycles that Earth travels, because it doesn't travel in a perfect circle, the exact number of years for each zodiac age may differ by a few decades or even a few hundred years. So some zodiac ages may be slightly longer than others. Now, the reason why I'm explaining this is that Earth is currently experiencing physical phenomena that generally signals a shift in the alignment of the Earth's axis, which is something that occurs. There are a lot of aspects of the Earth's behaviors that are related to this zodiac shift. Firstly, the spinning of the Earth's core speeds up and slows down over the course of time, relevant to the crust and mantle of the Earth's surface. This makes it appear sometimes to be spinning even in the opposite direction. I actually did an episode on that not that long ago. The Earth's north and south poles are magnetic, but those magnetic fields are not static. They also shift. In fact, the north magnetic pole is shifting northwesterly at quite a rapid rate right now. And that is something that science is observing, because obviously the northern magnetic force is what we base our navigation systems on. There's a lot of technology that requires our understanding of the magnetic forces of north and south to be accurate. So we have to continuously observe the changes that are taking place in the Earth. There will come a time when the magnetic South Pole becomes the magnetic North Pole. This is something that does happen. It takes a very long period of time. It doesn't happen overnight, but it does happen very gradually due to lots of different incremental changes that are taking place inside the Earth, on the Earth's surface, in the atmosphere, and in relation to the Earth's relationship to the cosmos. Things like changes in weather pattern will occur, and natural disasters may become more or less prevalent in certain parts of the world. Rain patterns may change, the frequency of things like volcano eruptions and earthquakes may change, and the Earth's crust is continuously moving as well. The polar ice caps are melting, oceans are shifting and changing shape, and while all of this contributes a little bit, and then a little bit more, and then a little bit more to a much bigger picture. And this is not a science lesson, and I'm not a scientist, right? But what I do know is that when we look at each of the Earth's various behaviors individually, they each have only a very subtle impact on the Earth as a whole. But if you look at it all together, and if you consider the cosmic alignments that also rotate in either phases of 2,150 zodiac years, or 28,500 years of the combined zodiac rotation, and the shifting of the ice caps and oceans and north and south polar shifts and the spinning of the Earth's core and the elliptical nature of the Earth's rotations, when you put it all together, what it looks like is that every now and then things have changed so much that a rewrite becomes necessary. And I think I can prove it. So the Hebrew Bible dictates, based on rotations of the Earth and its relationship to the binary star, the sun, things like the dates of the equinox and the dates for Passover and things like that. And the Christian Bible takes those dates and translates them into Christmas and Easter and various other events that are all based on the Hebrew Bible. And the Hebrew Bible is all based on the celestial movements and the Earth's relationship to its binary star, the sun. But because everything shifts as a result of a shift in cosmic alignment, like I've just mentioned, and in particular, the Earth's equatorial alignment to the zodiac constellations, well, what that means is that eventually all of the dates that appear in the Bible will be wrong. The equinox will be at a different time, and the equator will be in a different location, and things like that. And everything will need to be updated to correspond with the new zodiac age. So I'm going to attach the episodes that I did relating to this in case you're interested in going back. The episode on the zodiac ages and the episode on the spinning of the Earth's core are examples. When you put it together with today's show, see, I'm getting to a point, when you put it together with today's show, what becomes clear is that as the Earth continues its motions internally, externally, and cosmically, its axis shifts. And eventually all of the things that form the basis for our traditions and beliefs and basically our reality are no longer relevant. Things like the summer and winter equinox, the seasons, the direction of north, the energy fields will be increasingly misaligned, leading to phenomena that we need to be made aware of in order to survive. And so what I'm proposing is that every 2,000 or so years, when we shift into a new zodiac age, a maintenance crew has to pop in and set us straight. And maybe when they do show up, they announce themselves to be God's crew, the new God, the new sun god. And that relates directly to the shift in perspectives, religiously speaking, the perceptions of a new sun god every 2,000 or so years, which science and archaeology has proven outright, and also the arrival of beings that set down rules for us to live by before they disappear, such as the Annunaki. It's just a theory. Okay, so let's return back to the story of the Annunaki, because I think as the show develops, you'll be able to see what I'm talking about even more. So this is obviously how the Annunaki arrived on Earth and then created their first human, Adama, that appears as Adam in the book of Genesis. Well, if Anu's son Enlil, who is the Anunnaki son that was in charge of the earth, the god of air, and is described in Sumerian texts as being the cruel and vindictive god, if he was the one in charge, then I guess that Enlil is also the god Yahweh, who appears in the Old Testament, because Yahweh is the god that created Adam. Right. And Enlil may not have created Adam all by himself. This may have been something that was done with DNA manipulation by a team of Anunnaki. But Enlil is the one who is responsible. And Enlil is the one who is responsible to oversee Adama, or Adam, as described in the book of Genesis. And Enlil was awful. And so chances are he is the god Yahweh that also appears in the Old Testament. And this is not just my theory. This is something that Heather Lynn raises in her book, The Anunnaki Connection. I told you guys, when I finished the Bible, I knew it was a story about something. And I was pretty sure it was a story about aliens. And it turns out I'm not the only one. Paul Wallace believes it, Heather Lynn believes it, and Heather Lynn is a historian and archaeologist, and also others believe it as well. And what gives this theory credence is that we each reached our conclusions independently from one another, and we all looked at it from a completely different perspective. I reached my conclusion because I was just curious. I'm not religious, I'm not a historian, I just was reading the Bible for the sake of having done it. And that's the conclusion that I reached after reading it, that it's a book about aliens. And Paul Wallace reached his conclusion while he was working as a minister in the church. So he looked at it from a religious perspective. And Heather Lynn reached the same conclusion while she was working on the history and archaeological findings relevant to the ancient Mesopotamians. So the only difference between these people and others like them is that they're willing to look beyond the restrictive dogma that generally affects powerful or influential people when they get to a point where they have to continuously protect themselves from falling off their perch. So traditional scientists make a name for themselves that leads to, to funding and prestige when they discover something that corresponds with what everyone else has already discovered. So that's the way to succeed in science, is you find another brick that builds the house, the construction of belief that your colleagues have already found. If you find a brick that doesn't fit with the established construction and the established narrative, then you're called a pseudoscientist or a quack, and you're told that it just doesn't hold water. And the same goes for the beacons of the religious community. So look at Chris Bledsoe, for example. He was a pillar of his church community until he started telling people that he saw something that didn't fit with the teachings of the church. And then he was ostracized and told that he was a demon fraternizer. I mean, it's just the way that we are. You either have to stick with the status quo or you're considered to be a bit of a quack. So Heather Lynn and Zachariah Sitchin and Paul Wallace, and myself, we've all approached it from a different perspective, but we've all reached the same conclusion. And that conclusion seems to demonstrate that the Bible, for example, is a story about aliens. And the Sumerian texts also appear to be a story about the same aliens, which is the Annunaki. So if you're still not sure whether you believe me, we're going to go back to the Sumerian text again, because this bit might knock your socks off a little bit in terms of coincidence. So the first human created according to the Sumerians, written, 5,000 years ago, the Sumerian text was a fellow called Adama. And of course, in the Old Testament, Book of Genesis, the first human was Adam. Well, Adama was created for the purposes of taking over the hard labour that was previously being performed by the Agigi according to the Sumerian texts. According to the Sumerian texts, and the Agigi were the ones who went on strike. And guess where Adama was located or kept after he was created? He was kept in a place called Eden, spelled Edin. That sounds a lot like Eden, doesn't it? From the Garden of Eden in the Book of Genesis. It's uncanny. So now Zachariah Sitchin wrote in his book, The 12th Planet, that Eden was likely not to be a garden of paradise, but more like a laboratory or some other kind of location within Mesopotamia that was dedicated to the cultivation of the first humans. Maybe it was some kind of a beautifully landscaped area of the earth where they were just expected to breed, I don't know. But this is where they were first created and genetically modified. But there is also scope for Eden to be a place of hard labour, as we're about to see now, which makes me wonder why this isn't admitted in the Bible. Perhaps because it makes the whole biblical reason for creating Adam and Eve start to fall apart. So let's continue. When it comes to the Anunnakis, Enlil and Enki were the brothers. Both were Anunnaki, and both were sons of the god, the king of the gods, Anu. Anu was the king of the gods, the king of the family of gods. And that would coincide with another aspect of the Old Testament, and that is the reference to the family of gods. When translated correctly, which it's not at the moment, not when you read the English translation, but when it is translated correctly, the Bible and Genesis refers to that family as the Elohim, because the ancient Hebrew word Elohim literally means family of gods. So Enlil and Enki had the same father, Anu, but they had different mothers. And this might allow for there to be an overlap between today's episode and an episode that I did a couple of weeks ago about the Gnostic Gospel of John. I don't know, but it was in part 2 of that series of episodes that I talked about a goddess called Sophia, who had created a problem child who was disformed and who became bitter. And he went on to create Earth and humanity according to the Gnostics. I just don't know if there's a relationship there, but the fact that Enlil and Enki came from a different mother means that it's worthwhile me going to have a look one day. It just makes me wonder if there's another link in the chain. I'll also attach my playlist for the Gnostic Gospels in the description below so that you can see the relationship if you are interested at all. Anywho, so the dynamics between Enki and Enlil become pivotal. Enki, who was known as the god of wisdom and water, supported the idea of granting knowledge and autonomy to humans. He saw potential in humanity and believed that empowering them would benefit both species. So would benefit the Annunaki and the humans. So Enki was a democratic kind of god. Enlil, on the other hand, the god of air, was also the primary enforcer of the Anunnaki laws, and he was vehemently opposed to this idea. He feared that if humanity became too knowledgeable and too empowered, they would become too powerful and they might challenge the Anunnaki's authority. So Enlil was the authoritarian kind of god, a bit like Yahweh. Well, I think he was Yahweh. Once the first humans were created, they multiplied and formed a vast labor force. Humanity took over all of the mining responsibility and the other arduous tasks that were previously performed by the Ajiji. So this shift allowed the Ajiji and the Anunnaki elites to withdraw from any kind of physical labor and focus on governance and development. But the rivalry between the brothers Enlil and Enki began to create tensions that echoed throughout the Anunnaki society. Enki was the firstborn to Anu from a different mother. He was a masterful scientist and an engineer credited with the creation of humans. So Enki may very well have been the one that created the humans, or at least created the genetic formula to be able to give rise to an intelligent species of human. But Enlil held the title of heir to the earth and humanity because of his mother. His mother had a royal lineage, whereas Enki did not. And that makes me wonder, if Enlil's mother was a royal, who was she in terms of being an Anunnaki royal? It just, the mind boggles, doesn't it? So Enlil, given his birthright, was given the task of enforcing the Anunnaki laws and being the leader who ruled over the humans. The differing perspectives of the two sons impacted not only their own family, but also humanity. Enki's compassion led him to share knowledge with the humans. And this might link directly to the Garden of Eden story of the snake sharing knowledge with Adam and Eve, or encouraging knowledge acquisition by Adam and Eve. However, it is described differently by the Sumerians. The Sumerians describe the knowledge that Enki shared to be more along the lines of astrology, mathematics, architecture, and agriculture. Because of that knowledge and Enki's encouragement, the human civilizations began to flourish. Enlil, however, the Yaki son, well, he was stricter and wanted to enact stringent control over humanity at all times. He wanted to keep them under very close supervision and strict enforcement. It was during this time that humanity appears to have travelled through that 190,000 missing years that separate the barbaric and primitive Homo erectus to the sudden advancement of the Homo sapien. And according to the Sumerian tablets, humanity was in awe of the advanced technology and remarkable longevity of life of the Anunnaki. Each of the Anunnaki were able to live for thousands and thousands of years. I think I recall that a single Anunnaki year was equivalent to 3,600 human years. So a single Anunnaki's influence could transform generations of humans very rapidly under their guidance. This might explain the otherwise inexplicable archaeological finds that we simply just can't fathom. There are so many of them that I might actually do an episode when I look at a selection of them in greater detail on a future show. But one of the oldest findings that I can use as an example today is Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. Göbekli Tepe is an archaeological site dating back to around 9,600 BC. It features T-shaped stone pillars arranged in a circle with intricate carvings of animals and symbols. It is said to have been built before the advent of agriculture, and so the scientists have defaulted to the viewpoint that it must have been nomadic tribes that suddenly did the most unnomadic thing imaginable. They grouped together and hung around for a while to build a completely unnecessary large-scale construction project. I mean, the whole point of being nomadic and part of a nomadic tribe is that you don't stay in one place for very long. You basically follow your food source wherever it might take you. That's the whole point of being nomadic. Can you see? Like, the official explanation just doesn't make any sense. But science has to validate its current position. So it just fills in the blanks with a simple explanation, that must have been the case, of whatever fits the status quo narrative. The fact is, plain and simple, that the Göbekli Tepe site is just one example of archaeological findings that disprove the current scientific theories of evolution. It just proves that we are officially wrong. And interestingly, other archaeological findings also show that at one point, humanity was more advanced, potentially, than we are now. Or perhaps it's more accurate to say that humanity has a different type of advancement. The focus was on different aspects of advancement, but that somehow that knowledge got forgotten along the way. And on that note, I'm once again going to return to the Bible, because something happened next that also appears in the Bible and in the Sumerian texts. So for millennia, the Anunnaki worked alongside humans, sowing the seeds of knowledge and civilization. Grand cities were built, maybe including, Atlantis, for example. Laws were codified and culture blossomed under their guidance. However, as with everything else in life, the whole thing started to get a bit stale, because, it always does. The crisis on Nibiru began to stabilize, lessening the urgency to mine Earth's gold. Internal conflicts between the Anunnaki leadership continued to fracture and strain their mission. And the rivalry between Enki and Enlil escalated, leading to factions and dissent among their followers. There was division between those that followed Enki and those that followed Enlil. And so there was a division among humanity as well. Tensions eventually reached a breaking point. Enlil became frustrated with humanity's growing independence and defiance. After all, he was the jealous god. I mean, if you don't believe me, just take a look at the Ten Commandments. Enlil proposed drastic measures to curtail the human population. He wanted to cull them, get rid of them. Get rid of the ones he didn't like. Enki, however, the compassionate god, well, he strongly disagreed. He was the protector of mankind, and he sought to preserve human life. And this is where the Bible's great flood story comes in, because this also is inferred within the Sumerian literature. It's said that Enlil orchestrated a deluge to reset the world, and Enki was strongly opposed to that move, but it was officiated by the Anunnaki government or council or family structure. And Enki decided he was going to kind of skip off and give warning to one of his followers. And so Enki warned one of his followers, a righteous man who in Mesopotamian writings has a variety of different names. In fact, his names are pretty difficult to pronounce en masse. I know that one of them is Atrahasis, But the others I'm not even going to bother trying. So instead of trying to butcher them, I'm going to add them to the screen for those who are watching. And you can butcher the names yourself by trying to pronounce them. Enki told the man to build a vessel in order to save himself, his family, and specimens of all living creatures. Specimens. Not the creatures themselves as described in the Bible, but specimens. Perhaps the specimens were DNA specimens. There are ancient carvings all over the world that depict craft that look like submarines or helicopters or aeroplanes or even spacecraft, vessels of some kind. And there are also ancient carvings around the world that depict entwined strings of what appear to be DNA. I'm intending to look at these phenomena in a future episode as well, because the way in which the Sumerian writings describe the Noah's Ark story, it seems as though the vessel being used by Noah, or whatever they were calling him at the time, was not actually an ark. It might have been submerged underwater. It may have been a submarine. And if that is the case, then it links directly to the ancient carvings of what appears to be submarines and DNA strands that appear around the world and never really get a lot of mention in scientific circles. These carvings generally are not on display in tourist locations around the world, but they certainly do exist. And so Enlil decided to do away with humanity because he was just so disgusted at the fact that they were getting too big for their boots. And the Anunnaki prepared to depart Earth because obviously they didn't want to drown, and they left in airborne craft. The Sumerians write of the Anunnaki leaving Earth in vessels that rise into the heavens. So meanwhile, the floods came and killed an entire race of humans, except a few, who had been saved by the Anunnaki brother called Enki. Some of the knowledge, the most basic knowledge of the time, was remembered and used to rebuild a new world for humanity, but most of the knowledge was lost in the flood. And humanity has had to relearn or learn new advancements since then. So according to Zecharia Sitchin's hypothesis, when the Anunnaki left Earth, they didn't entirely abandon human affairs. Instead, they established governments or systems of government to maintain order. Human kings were appointed as representatives of a divine authority, and this also coincides with the various books of the Old Testament. There is also an ancient manuscript that was recorded in cuneiform writings from the Sumerian period called the Sumerian Kings List, which details the reign of kings stretching back from before the Great Flood. The Sumerians' Kings List notes that kingship descended from heaven, which signifies that it was bestowed upon humanity by the gods. And these rulers were charged with upholding the will of the Anunnaki, maintaining society's structures, enforcing its laws. And this is where the concept of kings and law-keeping, but also priests and religious rituals stems from. It all comes from the Sumerians. And it appears to have been transferred over thousands of years later to the Hebrew Bible's account of humanity's creation. Except the Hebrew Bible's account is missing the most important aspects of the truth. It's missing the fact that laws and priests and kings and traditions and rituals are all just a construct to keep humanity under the control of an extraterrestrial family of gods that have been seemingly gone from Earth for thousands of years, perhaps even hundreds of thousands of years. Interestingly, the Bible does appear to coincide with the Sumerian writings in one crucial respect. What you can see if you're watching is a visualization between the Sumerian Kings List and the biblical genealogies of the patriarchal system before the Great Flood and after the Great Flood. Before the Great Flood, when the Anunnaki was said to still be on the earth, the lifespan of rulers was between 28,000 and 43,000 years, human years, each ruler. After the Great Flood, however, once the Anunnaki was gone, the lifespan of the patriarchal leaders, as depicted in both the Sumerian text and the Bible, was reduced to around 1,000 years, and it continued to decline gradually over the course of time until it reached an average lifespan of under 100 years. It's only recently that the human lifespan has begun to increase again, slightly. And that is due to the advent of life-saving medicines and technologies, which then makes you wonder how advanced life must have been before to be able to keep people alive for 28 or so thousand years. So that is the story of the Anunnaki, a race of beings that came to Earth looking for gold because their own planet was in a dire situation. They created humanity as a workforce to mine for gold and perform other tasks, and some of the Anunnaki stayed and ruled over the world as gods. But then eventually they returned back to their own home, a planet referred to as Nibiru in the Sumerian texts. Humanity was created and was taught to be extraordinary in its advancement, but our very existence created a dilemma for the Anunnaki. Should we be permitted to learn and grow and thrive, even if it means we begin to rebel against our rulers? Or should we be kept ignorant, like slaves, working for the benefit of our rulers? And this is a dilemma that people can still feel playing out even today. And it's a dilemma that almost every perspective, whether it be religious or otherwise, seems to be embroiled in. Should we be allowed to advance, or should we be kept ignorant? It's interesting. Eventually the Anunnaki left. But when they did, they took away some of our advancement, and we had to begin again. And this time we appear to have gone a slightly different kind of route. We've learned a lot about how to cultivate the earth for our own purposes, but we continue to have barbarian roots that remind us where we came from, and our earth appears to be changing in ways that happens over the course of time, every 2,000 years or so. And if the stories are generally true, if they are more than just myths or fantasies, then it's nearly time for the Anunnaki, or perhaps a delegated force, to return. God's maintenance crew could be coming back soon, returning to Earth to do a shift in our perspective, to realign us towards the new zodiac age, or perhaps to wake us up to where we came from and who we really are. There is one thing we know for sure, and that is that there is more to what science and religion officially tells us. It's written in the Sumerian tablets and other writings from Mesopotamia, and it is found in archaeological findings all over the world. And that's why we should never take the truth for granted. Instead, we should remain curious as to what remains undiscovered and how it may link to what we already know. The answer is certainly out there, somewhere. And wouldn't it be a funny twist of fate if you and me found that answer one day right here on this show? My name is Ellie, and you can find me at Ellie Dreams Down Under on YouTube. But before I go, let me share a little secret with you. I want you to know that I don't get paid to produce this show on KGRA. I am very grateful that KGRA gives me a platform to be able to share my research with you. But everything I do here on the show, I do it for free. It takes a lot of work to produce a single episode. 1 hour episode can sometimes take days and even weeks of research. But it's something I love to do, and I'd like to do it more and more and more as time goes on. So I do hope you'll remember that and do what you can to support my work. If you can, please subscribe to my channel at Ellie Dreams and Under on YouTube, like and share my videos, comment and engage with other viewers, and keep coming back. Every bit helps. And thanks to everyone who is listening today on one of KGRA's broadcasting platforms. If you would like to become a member of the KGRA viewership family and hang out with like-minded watchers, experiencers, spiritualists and weirdos like me, then just go to live.kjradb.com and enter promo code Ellie to get 30% off your subscription. That's it for today. It's been a pleasure. Until next time.